everyone, and welcome to the Sania Farooqui Show. Joining us once again today, we have Shada Islam. She is a respected and well-known Brussels-based commentator on European affairs who now works independently as an advisor, analyst, strategist, and commentator. Shada worked for 9 years as Director of Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe, an influential independent think tank based in Brussels. She now runs her own Brussels-based global media strategy and advisory company, New Horizons Project. She is a senior advisor at European Policy Center and at the Center for Global Development. She's also the editor of EUObserver Magazine and writes regularly for The Guardian, East Asia Review, Straits Times, and the EUObserver. In 2017, Politico identified her as one of the 20 most influential women in Brussels. Lovely to have you back on the Sania Farooqui Show, Shada. We're speaking after almost 2 years, so lovely to connect again.
It's great. It's great to be with you again, Sania. 2 years, my heavens, how time flies. What a journey.
Likewise, but good to have you back. So, Shada, we're speaking after almost 2 years now. The last time we discussed many things, focusing primarily on Islamophobia in Europe and also the Black Lives Matter movement in Europe. Tell me, it's 2022. Many changes have taken place. What are we seeing happening now?
So, Sania, these last 2 years have been quite a journey for the European Union as well. So it's, the Black Lives Matter movement, 2020 June was quite a wake-up call for the European Union in terms of heightened awareness of our own problems of racism and discrimination and violence against ethnic minorities. So that was quite an important moment in terms of a waking up of Europe, a rising of awareness and consciousness, if you like. So many things were quickly done, including an anti-racism action plan that was drawn up by the European Commission then and there, really very fast, and is they're trying to implement it now. But Brussels, what happens in Brussels doesn't always sort of be implemented by member states. We're 27 EU countries. So what happens in Brussels are guidelines, they're political steer, if you like, and it's member states that actually have to implement those rules. And that's where the problems come in, because 27 countries have very different approaches towards ethnic minorities, and discrimination is different in many countries. So there is an awareness now of systemic racism, institutional racism, a move away from the feeling that it's only, individuals or bigots who are responsible for racist action, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the Polish Justice Party, which are very clearly bigoted, especially against Muslims. But now an awareness that unconscious bias and institutional racism is a problem. And the other thing I would say that's quite interesting is that there is a more conscious and more powerful, potent anti-racism movement across Europe. It's nothing like the United States yet, but we're getting there. We're getting to be more active, and our voice is stronger now than ever before.
What can you tell us about European Union's drive to create a union of equality, and what are the obstacles and challenges in the way?
So the European Commission here in Brussels, which is the executive agency, has said repeatedly that it wants to create a union of equality. And that means that no one is equal unless everyone is equal, so trying to really sort of eliminate all these inequities and injustices that are ingrained and embedded in the current system. Those are words, and policies have followed. They've brought out policies against discrimination against the gay people, against Roma, anti-Semitism. There is not yet anti-racism, as I said earlier as well, but they haven't brought out a strategy for fighting Islamophobia, or what they call anti-Muslim hatred. So there's a little bit of hierarchy going on within the sort of equality agenda, if you like, which I think is very troubling and makes many of us very uneasy. And there's this certain element of selective outrage when inequalities are brought to the fore, which inequalities are considered to be politically very important to tackle immediately. Anti-Semitism, anti-Roma, anti-gay strategies are very potent against discrimination against disabled people with disabilities. But there isn't yet one against anti-Muslim hatred. And I think this selective outrage is a problem for Europe.
What creates this growing anti-Muslim sentiment, whether it is in the form of discrimination, stigmatization, or exclusion in areas of life such as employment, education. We keep seeing countries banning hijab or the head cover used by Muslim women in the region. Islamophobia is a very specific form of racism. Why is Europe failing to tackle it?
So they have tried to tackle it. And as I said, this anti-racism action plan that the European Commission has brought out talks about anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia as well. The problem comes when member states, the 27 countries, have to actually implement and enforce that. And that's where the national prejudices and biases against Muslims comes to the fore. The European Commission actually is trying its best to be equal in its treatment of inequities across the European Union. There is if I would say to you, it's too closely linked. Islamophobia is linked to the counter-terrorism strategies that the European Union has been implementing actually since 9/11. That was quite a defining moment, as it was the world over in terms of perceptions of Muslims. And since then, Sania, every time there's a terrorist attack by Islamists, either linked to Al-Qaeda or, Islamic State, etc., there is collective guilt that is thrown on Muslims. So every single Muslim is considered to be, quote unquote, responsible for the actions of an extremist minority, a very small minority, if you like. So instead of treating terrorism as a criminal act, as many countries do in the world, the European governments have tended to make it into a kind of institutionalized Islamophobia, if you like. And that is a major problem. The securitization of the Muslim communities is a major problem across the European Union. And that, I think, is something that has to be fought and combated by anti-racist activists, and including myself. And that stigma is something that has become embedded in the European psyche. It sort of casts a dark shadow over Muslim communities. And that's become extremely frustrating for many Muslims in Europe who do not, the vast majority are law-abiding citizens, tax-paying citizens. They're European. We are European, we're not foreigners. And there is this kind of perception that Muslims in Europe are foreigners, perpetual foreigners. And there's this feeling that they are not really part of Europe, that they don't belong here. And that is a deeply embedded narrative that many of us are trying to really remove from the story of Europe.
Yeah. And whenever we discuss racism and Islamophobia in Europe, one of the arguments that comes up is, as you also just spoke about, the European way of life. What is it, and why are immigrants, people of color, refugees, Muslims, who often do fall into all of those categories, not considered part of this European way of life?
So this is really a very interesting question, and I think one that needs to be studied in greater detail than we've done so far. European way of life really is a dog whistle to the far right, which is constantly telling us, the far right, which has captured mainstream politics in Europe, and we can talk about that in a second. So the far-right discourse, the very toxic and corrosive discourse on Muslims as perpetual foreigners, as I said, and outsiders, has sort of crept into institutions and policymaking and become part of the mainstream. So that is a question of what is the European way of life? For many, it's about being Christian and about being white. And so anyone who doesn't fall into those categories is seen as not belonging to Europe. And that just means, we are 50 million people of color, Europeans of color across the European Union. That's a major number of people, it's not just a small minority. And that means that, migrants are part of that, and refugees that are coming in, but also Europeans, full-fledged Europeans. And this creates a narrative of Europe, which is so pathetically out of date and out of touch with the reality of the diverse and multicultural Europe that there is today. Go to any European city, Sania, and you will see how people of color, Europeans of color, migrants, refugees, Europeans are changing the face of Europe in many, many beneficial and good ways.
What are your comments on the recent French election? Also in a piece written by you for The Guardian earlier in January this year, you said European Muslims were concerned about the French stint in the EU chair as they feared France's divisive anti-Muslim political discourse could seep into EU policy making? Has that happened?
Well, yes and no, because to be quite frank, I mean, the French discourse during the presidential elections was extremely, extremely poisonous. And of course, the major parties espoused that discourse, including the French Republicans, where you had the candidate Valérie Pécresse talking about the great replacement theory. You had ministers from Emmanuel Macron, the president's party, being very, very Islamophobic, and not to mention Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, who are, self-identified totally as populists and far right. So it was a very, very painful moment. The fact of the matter is that across the European Union, there is inherent Islamophobia. You see it in the Netherlands. There's a huge scandal at the moment about the pension system, where the ministers actually had to accept that there was institutional racism in the way they identified so-called, let's say, people who were abusing employment benefits. And that was based on things like their names, so foreign names, meaning i.e. Muslim names, or whether they were making donations to mosques. You've got this in Sweden now, where the far right, man from the far right is threatening or has burnt the Quran. You see it in Denmark. You see it also in Austria, where there is also this idea that somehow Muslims are inherently a threat to the European Union, regardless of whether they're not extremist or linked to any Islamist parties. So the French narrative amplified, if you like, all of these different negative discourses. And because France is such a powerful and important country in the European Union, these discourses then sort of crept in even more. And more practically, this anti-racism action plan that I was talking to you about, the references in it to Islamophobia were eliminated or watered down in the final sort of blueprint that came out. And constantly, the minute they see a woman with a hijab, the French, meeting, say, a European commissioner, there was this incident where young women from an association of young students with the headscarf met the commissioner responsible for equality, and then she was pilloried. The commissioner was pilloried for having links with Islamist groups, just on the basis of this young woman who was wearing a headscarf. So a lot of this is, I laugh at it, but it's painful. It's very painful when you're actually living through it, because it's almost a witch hunt, and it's been called by the anti-racist organizations as Islamophobic witch hunt, which is a terrible, terrible reflection on our Europe today and on France today. It has to do with the fact that France takes pride in its secularism, laïcité, and any wearing or any sort of visible symbol of religious affiliation is considered to be against secularism. But the headscarf story just goes beyond that, because you've also heard, Sania, about the burkini and how that is creating problems in France, about wearing a burkini or halal food. So it's turned into a bit of a racket, an Islamophobic social drama constantly.
Yeah. But do you think Islamophobia manifested through policies or legislations that are now indirectly targeting or are affecting Muslims living in Europe? We've seen this happen to Muslim women, as you just mentioned about the burkini and the hijab ban. Just talking to a Muslim woman seems like it's a crime. But apart from that, what are the other similar worrying policies that take agencies and freedoms from European citizens who just happen to be of a particular faith?
So there is, and this has been documented by the EU's own Fundamental Rights Agency and by the Council of Europe, there is violence, ethnic profiling, police violence against Muslims, people with the Muslim names, or people who look like Muslims, because that's another thing. It's not just Muslims, it's people who look like Muslims. Gendered Islamophobia, as I've told you, leads to incidents in trams and buses, public transport, where women are actually being attacked for wearing a headscarf, and other people are watching and they do not intervene. Of course, there's discrimination in terms of access to jobs, access to housing, sometimes access to health facilities as well. So there is discrimination that is rife, if you like. And the paradox is that, in fact, none of this is legal. None of this is allowed. And if these people were taken to court, which they often are, because Muslims in Europe now have a great deal of agency and are empowered and are doing so, they lose those battles, of course, because this is discriminatory. The European Union does not allow for any discrimination based on color, skin, race, religion. But these are embedded policies, practices, if you like, not policies, but practices, and it's very difficult to get rid of. So it's, as I said, the Black Lives Matter movement has made us all more aware of it, and made the institutions aware of the conscious and the unconscious bias. But finding a job with a Muslim name remains a problem for many young Muslims. And what many of them are doing actually to get around that obstacle is setting up their own companies. So if you look at the landscape, the economic landscape of Europe, many startups, technical, etc., technology, ICT, state-of-the-art startups are being set up by Muslim young men and women. Many, I have to confess, are also leaving Europe. They're going to either the Arab world or they're emigrating to Canada or the United States. So, it's being felt here. And this is something we need to be aware of. Europeans of color, Muslim Europeans are leaving.
Yeah. What can the European Union do to create a more inclusive environment? How can integration be made easier for those who are entering Europe as refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, or just to work and make a living? Like, we said, people are leaving right now, but how can that be changed? Right now, we're also seeing one of the largest movements of refugee and migrants, and this refugee crisis is being said to be worst refugee crisis since the end of World War II. So there's a lot that Europe has on its platter. What can it do right now to make it better?
So I think the first thing, as I said to you, Sania, is a change in narrative so that we recognize fluid identities and we enlarge the definition of Europe, the idea of Europe, to not just white and Christian. And to acknowledge that Europeans of color, whether they're Muslim or any other religion, are major contributors to the European economy, to our societies, to our social and cultural life. Europe's response to the pandemic spotlighted the role of migrants and people of color in the health sector. Our doctors, our nurses, our hospital workers, our bus drivers, our metro drivers, people who work in supermarkets, all the essential workers are people of color. Many of them are Muslims, not to mention our sports stars, our singers, our rappers, and some of our very, very important politicians. So I think we need to recognize that all of us are part of the European landscape and are European, even if we do have what many believe are hyphenated nationalities. We are Asian European, we can be Indian European or African European, but we're all European. So first of all, it's that narrative. And that has to come from the top. Angela Merkel, when she was in power in Germany, did make a very strong attempt actually to be more welcoming and to talk about fluid identities. She said, we have to stop asking people of color, where are they from? They are European as well. And the second thing is we're doing it now. We're doing it now with Ukrainian refugees. We've opened our arms, we've opened our homes, we've opened our schools, our hospitals to millions of Ukrainian refugees who are here, which is great. It's a sense of compassion, empathy, solidarity. Why can't we show that to people fleeing wars and hunger and climate change from other parts of the world? Why are they kept in camps? Why are they pushed back by Frontex, our border control? And why can't they be welcomed with the same sense of compassion and empathy? Ukrainians are getting temporary settlement allowances. They're allowed to stay here without visa. None of this is being offered to other refugees and asylum seekers. So a couple of things that do give me a degree of optimism is that across the European Union, public and private sector, so businesses, are working very hard on a diversity and inclusion agenda. So they're really going out of the way to respond to critiques of inequities and reaching out to people, underrepresented groups, making sure that they are brought into the mainstream. And that's very, very reassuring. And the European Union institutions themselves have recently done a staff survey and realized and recognized that there are very few people of color within the EU institutions. So they have promised also to go out of their way, let's say beyond what they usually do in terms of recruiting people of color, underrepresented groups into the European Union institutions, whether they're based in Brussels or elsewhere. And governments across are conscious of this. So there is a change that is happening. It's happening very slowly, but I've seen over the last 2 years that it's speeded up. And these, as I said earlier, we're more aware of these deficiencies, these weaknesses in our system, and how they actually impact on policymaking and also on our own search for more dynamism and better equity within the system. And finally, I would say it's integration. I mean, Europe needs foreign labor. Europe needs the talents of all of its citizens. You know, we're going into a recession, we're going into an economic slowdown, and we need all hands on deck, and we don't have that now. And my final point would be, if you are showing such discrimination at home, you're hardly in a position as the EU to stand on the global stage and talk about human rights and the rights of women and ethnic minorities. If you're not practicing at home, what you're telling others to do abroad, you're losing your geopolitical influence and heft that you could have in this very complicated world.
All right, Shada, on that note, I'm going to end and wrap this conversation. Thank you so much. An absolute pleasure, as always, to speak to you and to have you back on the Sania Farooqui Show today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sania. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And for those of you who've tuned in, I hope you will subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Spotify. I'm going to see you again next week, so stay tuned.